History rarely whispers as loudly as it does here, because at the center of Christianity stands a woman who disappears, and then reappears at the most explosive moment of the story, forcing historians to ask an unsettling question. Why did Mary Magdalene matter so much to Jesus that later generations struggled to explain her away? Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the forbidden relationship, does not describe a hidden romance proven by secret documents, but rather a historically verifiable tension created by texts, memory, and authority. To understand why the relationship between Jesus of Nazareth and Mary of Magdala became controversial, one must begin not with speculation but with the earliest surviving sources. In the canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, Mary Magdalene is not introduced as a peripheral follower. She is named repeatedly at decisive moments. Mark's Gospel, widely regarded by scholars such as Bart D. Ehrman as the earliest written account, places Mary Magdalene at the crucifixion when most male disciples have fled, and again at the tomb where she encounters the empty grave. This is not a narrative accident. In the ancient Mediterranean world, women's testimony carried limited legal weight, and yet the gospel tradition preserves Mary as the first witness to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. John's gospel goes further. In John chapter 20, Mary Magdalene stands alone at the tomb, weeping, until the risen Jesus addresses her by name. Only then does she recognize him. Scholars have long noted the intimacy of this recognition scene, not in a romantic sense, but in its depth of personal knowledge and trust. Raymond Brown and later Bart Ehrman emphasize that John deliberately elevates Mary's role by portraying her as the first to receive and transmit the resurrection message. In effect, she becomes the first apostolic witness, sent to announce the resurrection to the male disciples themselves. This prominence becomes even more striking when compared to how later Christian tradition remembered her. By the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great would publicly conflate Mary Magdalene with unnamed sinful women in Luke, and with Mary of Bethany, transforming her into a repentant prostitute in popular imagination. Modern historians widely agree this identification has no textual basis in the New Testament. The question, then, is why such a transformation occurred at all. To answer that, scholars turn to non-canonical early Christian writings discovered in the modern era, especially the Nag Hammadi library unearthed in Egypt in 1945. Among these texts is the Gospel of Mary, a fragmentary but crucial document dated by most scholars to the 2nd century. Though not written by Mary Magdalene herself, it preserves traditions about her authority within certain early Christian communities. In this text, Mary comforts the disciples after Jesus' departure and recounts private teachings she claims to have received directly from him. Peter challenges her legitimacy, asking whether Jesus would truly have spoken privately with a woman. Levi responds by defending Mary, suggesting that her insight comes from her closeness to Jesus. Bart Ehrman and Karen King have argued that the Gospel of Mary reflects early conflicts over leadership and authority rather than hidden marital secrets. Yet the very existence of this conflict shows that Mary Magdalene was remembered by some Christians as a privileged recipient of Jesus' teachings, someone whose relationship with him carried weight strong enough to provoke opposition. Another Nag Hammadi text, the Gospel of Philip, introduces language that has fueled centuries of misunderstanding. It refers to Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, using the Coptic term derived from the Greek koinonos. In one damaged passage, it describes Jesus kissing Mary more frequently than the other disciples, provoking their jealousy. Modern scholars, including Ehrman, caution against reading this through a modern romantic lens. In late antique religious literature, kissing often symbolized transmission of spiritual knowledge, and companion could denote partnership in teaching rather than marriage. Still, the jealousy motif is historically revealing. It suggests that Mary's closeness to Jesus, however defined, was perceived as a challenge to male authority. Importantly, no ancient text, canonical or non-canonical, explicitly states that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married or sexually involved. This absence matters. Jewish men of Jesus' time typically married, but exceptions existed, particularly among apocalyptic or prophetic figures. The Dead Sea Scrolls, studied extensively by scholars such as John J. Collins, demonstrate that some Jewish sectarians practiced celibacy for religious reasons. Thus, Jesus' unmarried status, if historical, would be unusual but not implausible. What makes the relationship forbidden is not evidence of romance, but the boundaries it crossed. In Second Temple Judaism, a woman publicly teaching men or transmitting authoritative religious instruction was culturally transgressive. That Mary Magdalene is portrayed as doing precisely this, especially in non-canonical texts, suggests that early Christians struggled with her memory. Some communities elevated her, others marginalized her. Over time, orthodoxy favored apostolic authority tied to male succession, while alternative traditions preserving Mary's prominence were labeled heretical and excluded from the canon. The Quran, written centuries later, does not mention Mary Magdalene by name, nor does it include narratives about Jesus' female disciples. Islamic exegetes such as Al-Tabari and Ibn Kathir focus instead on Maryam, the mother of Jesus, whose role is distinct and theologically central. The absence of Mary Magdalene from Islamic tradition underscores that her controversy is not universal, but specifically rooted in early Christian debates over authority, memory, and legitimacy. Modern scholarship approaches this topic cautiously. Elaine Pagels and Karen King emphasize that texts like the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip should be read as windows into early Christian diversity, not as coded revelations of secret romances. Bart Ehrman repeatedly stresses that while these texts reveal theological disputes, they do not provide evidence for a sexual relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. At the same time, historians acknowledge that later efforts to diminish Mary's role, by redefining her as a sinner rather than a teacher, reflect discomfort with a woman who stood too close to the center of the story. Thus, the historical tension does not lie in what the sources claim explicitly, but in what they struggle to control. Mary Magdalene appears at the crucifixion when others vanish, receives the resurrection message before anyone else, and in alternative traditions, speaks with an authority that unsettles male disciples. This combination made her memory powerful and, eventually, problematic. By the time Christianity became institutionally structured in the 4th century, authority rested increasingly on hierarchical office rather than charismatic witness. In such a framework, a woman remembered as Jesus' closest follower posed a challenge that theology alone could not easily resolve. Recasting her as a repentant sinner neutralized that challenge without erasing her entirely. The forbidden nature of the relationship, then, emerges not from romance, but from proximity, spiritual, instructional, and symbolic proximity to Jesus that later systems of authority found difficult to accommodate. It is in this tension between early memory and later control that the historical question of Jesus and Mary Magdalene truly resides, suspended between texts, traditions, and the silences that surround them. The struggle over Mary Magdalene's memory did not end with the exclusion of certain texts or the shaping of later doctrine. It continued quietly through interpretation, translation, and selective emphasis, leaving historians with a fragmented but telling record. When early Christianity spread across the Mediterranean world, communities inherited not a single unified story about Jesus and his followers, but competing traditions preserved in Greek, Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. What survived was not always what was earliest, but what aligned with emerging structures of authority. By the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, writers such as Irenaeus of Lyon were already drawing boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable Christian texts. Works like the Gospel of Mary and Gospel of Philip were criticized not primarily for historical claims, but for theological positions that elevated personal revelation over institutional control. Mary Magdalene's presence in these texts became part of a larger problem. If Jesus entrusted key teachings to someone outside the emerging episcopal hierarchy, then authority itself could not be neatly inherited through male succession. Scholars such as Karen King argue that Mary's marginalization reflects this anxiety more than any concern over impropriety. This helps explain why the canonical Gospels, though earlier, are themselves careful in how they portray Mary. They preserve her presence at crucial moments, but offer no extended reflection on her role after the resurrection announcement. The Book of Acts, which narrates the formation of the early church, does not mention her at all. For historians, this silence is as significant as the texts that speak. Bart Ehrman notes that Acts functions as a narrative of legitimacy, tracing authority from Jesus to the apostles and onward. Mary Magdalene does not fit comfortably into that line, despite her earlier prominence. Over time, interpretation hardened into tradition. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the late 4th century, his Vulgate preserved Mary Magdalene's name but inherited centuries of interpretive baggage. By the medieval period, sermons, art, and devotional literature emphasized her repentance rather than her testimony. The shift was subtle but decisive. Mary was remembered not as the first witness of resurrection, but as a symbol of forgiven sin. Historians such as Susan Haskins have shown how this transformation allowed Mary to remain visible while stripping her of authority. Modern scholarship began dismantling this image in the 19th and 20th centuries as historical critical methods re-examined the sources. The rediscovery and translation of early Christian texts forced scholars to confront how much had been filtered out. Yet even here, academic caution prevails. No serious historian argues that suppressed evidence proves a romantic or marital relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The primary texts simply do not support that claim. What they do support is something both more restrained and more challenging. That Mary Magdalene occupied a position of exceptional closeness and trust, remembered differently by different communities. Jewish historical context reinforces this reading. Jesus' movement operated within Second Temple Judaism, where discipleship involved itinerant teaching, shared meals, and intense personal bonds. Women are known to have supported such movements financially and logistically. as Luke explicitly notes when he names Mary Magdalene among those who provided for Jesus and his followers. This detail, often overlooked, places her within the inner circle, not on its margins. It also explains why her presence did not initially require explanation, but later did. The idea of a forbidden relationship thus emerges retrospectively. In the earliest layers of tradition, Mary's proximity to Jesus is presented without justification. Only when leadership structures solidify does that proximity become problematic. Forbidden, in this sense, means unsanctioned by later authority rather than morally transgressive by ancient standards. The discomfort arises not from sexuality, but from memory that cannot be fully controlled. The modern fascination with secret gospels and hidden marriages says more about contemporary concerns than ancient evidence. Scholars such as Ehrman repeatedly warn against projecting modern categories of romance, scandal, or conspiracy onto ancient texts that operate within symbolic and theological frameworks. At the same time, historians resist dismissing these texts as mere fantasy. They reflect real debates among early Christians about who had the right to speak for Jesus. Mary Magdalene stands at the center of those debates because she represents an alternative origin story for Christian authority, one rooted in witness rather than office, recognition rather than rank. That is why her figure persists, re-emerging whenever scholars return to the earliest sources. Each re-examination strips away layers of assumption and reveals a simpler but more unsettling picture, a woman whose testimony could not be erased, only reframed. In the end, the historical record does not offer a sensational revelation, but something quieter and more durable. It shows how memory is shaped by power, how silence can be as deliberate as speech, and how a relationship remembered too vividly can become dangerous to later systems that prefer clear lines of control. Jesus and Mary Magdalene remain linked not by proof of forbidden love, but by the enduring trace of closeness that early Christians could neither deny nor fully explain. If history is reconstructed not only from what was written, but also from what later generations felt compelled to change, what does Mary Magdalene's transformation tell us about whose voices early Christianity ultimately chose to preserve?